Elias Thorne looked at the paper. It was an offence, a piece of thin, brittle white nailed to the heartwood of his doorframe. The nail itself was the greater insult. It was black iron, factory-made, hammered crudely into the Douglas fir. That beam had been standing dead for 20 years, cured by wind and ice on the ridge, before Elias felled it. He had carried it down on his shoulders. He had shaped it with an adze, smoothing the grain until it felt like river stone. The nail was a violation. It was a wound in a perfect joint. The paper fluttered in the wind, which was starting to smell of high country snow. The ink was stark. It spoke of unauthorized structure, federal survey, and condemnation. It said the valley was now property of the railroad grant. It said his cabin, the work of 2 years, was illegal. It was signed by a man named Hargraves, an inspector from the east, a man who had looked at the cabin with dead eyes. Elias did not touch the paper. He stepped back, his boots crunching on the frosted dirt. He looked at his home. It was not a cabin, not really. It was a study in joinery. It was a fortress built of patience. The wind was picking up now, humming through the high pines, a sound that usually meant peace. Tonight it sounded like a warning. The smoke from his chimney, usually a lazy plume, was being torn apart by the gusts. The paper rattled against the wood. It was a weak, angry sound. Elias looked at the joints of the porch. He saw the interlocking timbers, the dovetails holding the beams, the wooden pegs that bound the structure. There was not a single iron nail in the entire frame, only wood, fitted to wood. Gravity and precision, the way the old world taught, the way the mountains demanded. Hargraves had seen none of it. He had seen only uncut logs. He had seen only a primitive's hut squatting on land designated for progress. The valley felt empty now. Hargraves and his 2 surveyors had left an hour ago. Their tracks were already fading as the wind moved the dust. But they had left a stain. The smell of their cheap cigars lingered, a sour note against the clean scent of pine and resin. Elias felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the coming winter. It was the coldness of paper, the coldness of men who see land only as lines on a map, men who believed a nail was stronger than a joint. He had built this place to honor the wood. He had built it to listen to the wind, not to fight it. And now the wind was bringing the inspector's judgment. The paper was a promise. They would be back in the spring. They would be back with crews and tools to tear it down. They would clear the valley for iron rails and steam engines. Elias looked up at the peaks, already white. The winter would be the first test. The inspector would be the second. He reached out and touched the wood around the nail. It was solid. It was true. The paper was a lie. The valley grew quiet again. A quiet that holds its breath. We're just settling in by the fire here. If this story finds you well, let us know in the comments where you're listening from, and what name the high country calls you by. 2 years before the paper was nailed to his door, Elias Thorne had arrived in the valley with nothing but a mule, a set of iron-banded chisels, an adze, a broadaxe, and a heavy mallet made of knotted oak. He carried the memory of an old Norwegian shipwright he had known in his youth, a man who had fled the sea and ended up building barns in the flatlands of Illinois. The old man had smelled of tar and tobacco. He had taught Elias that wood had a spirit. "You do not break it," the Norwegian had said, his voice a low rumble. "You do not force it with iron. You find how it wants to join. You lock it together, so that time and weight only make it stronger." Elias had carried those words west, looking for a place where such work still mattered. He found it in this valley, tucked beneath the granite teeth of the divide. It was a place of deep snow and sudden thaws, a place that broke lazy men and weak structures. He spent the first summer just watching. He watched the way the snow piled on the north slopes. He watched how the wind scoured the ridges. He watched where the runoff flowed in the spring. He walked the forests, not looking for logs, but for trees. He found the stand of Douglas fir, dead standing, hard as iron. He found the lodgepole pines, straight and true. He found the cedar for the roof shakes. He spent that first winter in a dugout shelter, burrowed into the hillside like a badger, and planned. He drew his cabin not on paper to be filed away, but in the dirt floor of his shelter. He planned the joints. He imagined the weight. When the spring thaw came, he began. He felled the trees with his axe, and he thanked each one. He used the mule to drag the logs to the flat ground he had chosen, a place sheltered by a granite spur, near the creek, but well above the floodline. He laid the foundation stones first, dry stacking them, fitting them so perfectly that not even a knife blade could find a gap. Then, the sills. He squared them with the broadaxe, the chips flying, the scent of fresh-cut pine sharp in the air. This was where the old tricks began. He did not spike them together. He cut mortise and tenon joints, a square hole in one log, a wooden tongue in the other. He carved them with his chisels, checking the fit, shaving away slivers of wood until they slid together with a solid, satisfying thump. He locked them with hardwood pegs, driven into offset holes, pulling the joint tighter than any nail ever could. The walls rose slowly. Each log was scribed and coped, fitting the contour of the log below it, shedding water, sealing out the wind. The corners were not simple saddle notches. They were full dovetail joints, locking the walls in two directions, making the structure rigid, immovable. The men from the east, the men with their sawmills and their kegs of nails, they built fast. They built boxes that leaked wind and shifted in the thaw. Elias was building a ship. He was building a fortress. He had visitors. The valley was known to the crow. An old warrior, kills the cold, would sometimes stop. He watched Elias work. The old man sat for hours, silent, watching the careful work of the chisels. He watched Elias raise the massive ridgepole, fitting it into dovetailed sockets on the gable ends. Kills the cold, understood. His own people built lodges that honored the circle, that moved with the seasons. He saw in Elias's work a different kind of honor, a static honor, a permanence. He touched the corner joints one day. "This," the old man said, "has the memory of the tree. It does not forget it is strong." Elias had nodded. It was the highest praise he had ever received. He had finished the roof before the first snows of the second winter. He had built his chimney of riverstone and clay. He had carved his door from a single massive slab of pine. He had built a home. He had built a place that belonged. He had no deed. He had no title. He had only the work and the respect of the mountain. He did not know that 1,000 miles away, men in dark suits were drawing straight lines over his valley, claiming it for a future they had never seen. The inspector arrived in the late fall, just as the aspens were losing their last gold. His name was Hargraves. He rode a fine bay horse that looked nervous in the high altitude. He wore a city coat and polished boots, and he carried a leather satchel. He was not alone. He had 2 men with him, carrying tripods and measuring chains. They were surveyors. They represented the land office and the greater power of the railroad. Hargraves did not greet Elias. He dismounted and walked around the cabin, his lip curled in faint disdain. He tapped on the dovetail corners with his riding crop. He looked at the heavy beams of the porch. "This is unauthorized," Hargraves said. His voice was thin, like dry paper. "This structure is not noted on the territorial survey." Elias stood by his door, his hands loose at his sides. "I built it," he said. It was the only answer he had. Hargraves sighed as if dealing with a slow child. "That is irrelevant. This valley is the designated right-of-way for the transcontinental northern spur. Your dwelling is an obstruction." He ran a gloved hand along the doorframe, the one Elias had spent a week shaping. "Where is the milled lumber? Where is the iron? This is primitive." The word hung in the cold air. Primitive. Hargraves looked at the intricate joinery, the work of a master craftsman, and saw only savage ignorance. He saw a lack of progress. He saw something that was not built from a blueprint. "This structure is not up to code," Hargraves said, though there was no code in these mountains but the law of survival. "It's a fire trap. It won't last the winter." Elias looked at the man. He looked at the man's thin coat, his soft hands. He looked at the cabin, built of logs 3 feet thick, joints locked as tight as granite. "It will stand," Elias said. The quiet certainty in his voice seemed to anger Hargraves. The inspector turned to his satchel. He pulled out the paper and a hammer. "This is a formal notice of condemnation. You are to vacate this structure by the spring thaw. If you are still here when the crews arrive, you will be removed by force, and this shack will be dismantled." He didn't ask Elias to take the paper. He turned to the doorframe. He pulled a nail from his pocket. Elias tensed. "Don't," he said. The word was low, almost a growl. Hargraves ignored him. He placed the nail against the wood and struck it hard with the hammer. Once, twice. The sound echoed in the valley. It was a sound of profound disrespect. It was the sound of the East driving its claim into the heart of the West. Hargraves and his men mounted up. They did not look back. They left the white paper fluttering, a ghost of a command nailed to the perfect wood. Elias stood there for a long time. The wind bit at his face. He felt the oath rise in him. It was not an oath of vengeance. It was not an oath of anger. It was an oath of stillness. He would not run. He would not fight. He would endure. This cabin was his testimony. It was built from the old ways, from timber joinery that had held ships together in North Sea gales. It was built to stand against the wind, against the snow, and against the brittle arrogance of men like Hargraves. The winter would come, and he would remain. The cabin and the man, they were one. The mountain did not move. The winter that followed was not a normal winter. It was a hammer. It was the kind of winter that stripped bark from trees and froze streams solid to the bottom. The old-timers called it a deep snow, a winter that buried the world and tested the souls of all living things. The first blizzard hit in November and lasted for 9 days. The wind came out of the north, a solid wall of ice and sound. It shrieked through the passes. It hit the cabin like a physical blow. Elias sat inside, feeding logs into his stone fireplace. He listened. He listened for the groan of wood, the whistle of drafts, the shift of a structure under load. He heard nothing. The scribed logs were sealed tight. The dovetail corners held the walls rigid. The heavy pegged roof did not move. The cabin was a stone in the river of wind. It did not fight the storm. It simply occupied its space. The wind had to go around. The snow piled up. It covered the low windows. It buried the porch. Soon the cabin was a white dome, only the stone chimney and a vent pipe showing. Elias had to dig a tunnel out from his door, a sloping passage up to the surface of the snow, just to breathe the air and check his snares. The temperature dropped to 40 below, a cold that could freeze a man's breath in his lungs. Inside the cabin, it was warm. The thick logs, the stone chimney, the moss-chinked gaps, they held the heat. The fortress held. He had firewood stacked high inside, meat cured and hanging from the rafters. He had built the cabin not just for shelter, but for siege, a siege by the sky. He spent the long, dark months carving, oiling his tools, mending his gear. He was not a prisoner. He was protected. The cabin was breathing with him. In the depths of January, during the brief, biting sunlight of midday, he saw movement on the ridge. It was a single figure struggling through the massive drifts. It was Kills the Cold. The old warrior was gaunt, his face grey with exhaustion and frostbite. His snowshoes were broken. He was carrying his rifle, but he was stumbling. Elias went out, breaking trail, and half-carried the old man back to the cabin. He brought him down the snow tunnel into the warmth. Kills the Cold collapsed on the bearskin near the fire. He had been tracking a winter-starved mountain lion, got caught in a ground blizzard, and lost his way. He had seen the smoke from Elias's chimney. It had saved him. Elias fed him hot broth. He tended to the man's frostbitten fingers. For 3 days the old warrior did not speak. He slept and ate and watched. He watched the inside of the cabin. His eyes, sharp despite his age, traced the lines of the joinery. He saw the massive posts that supported the ridgepole. He saw the interlocking pegs. He saw how the roof beams were locked in place without a single nail. He was inside the heart of the fortress. On the 4th day he spoke. "The white man builds with nails," Kills the Cold said, his voice raspy. "He builds fast. His lodges groan in the wind. They leak the cold. They fall down." He reached out and touched the wall, the perfect fit of the logs. This is different. This is the work of a patient spirit." Elias nodded, stirring the stew. "It's the old way," he said. "It's shipcraft, built to hold against the sea." The old warrior looked into the fire. "The sea, the snow," he said. "It is the same power. You have built a strong lodge, Elias Thorne. You have built a place that respects the winter." The alliance was sealed. It was not an alliance of men, but an alliance of respect. Respect for the wood, for the cold, and for the wisdom of building something true. The spring thaw came with violence. The mountains wept water. The snowpack, 30 feet deep on the slopes, turned rotten. The sound of the valley was no longer the whistle of wind, but the roar of water. The creek became a brown, churning river. The south-facing slopes, saturated and heavy, began to move. Small slides of mud and rock were common. Elias knew the thaw was the most dangerous time. The ground itself was treacherous, unstable. He also knew Hargraves would be back. The inspector was a man of the calendar. The condemnation notice had said, "Spring thaw." He would come. Elias and Kills the Cold, who had stayed through the worst of the winter, prepared. They did not prepare for a fight. They prepared for a confrontation. They shoveled the heavy, wet snow from the roof, lightening the load, though the beams had not bowed an inch. They cleared the mud that had slid near the foundation. They waited. Hargraves returned on a grey, misty morning. He brought 6 men with him this time. They were not surveyors. They were big, rough men, carrying axes, pry bars, and heavy sledges. They looked like railroad crew, men paid to break things. Hargraves rode to the front, his horse picking its way through the mud. He stopped, and his face was a mask of disbelief. The cabin was pristine. It stood solid, untouched. The chimney puffed gentle smoke. There was no damage, no crushed roof, no broken walls. It looked stronger than it had in the fall. "Thorne!" Hargraves shouted. "I see you have ignored the federal notice." Elias stepped out onto the porch. Kills the Cold stood behind him, in the shadow of the doorway. "The cabin stands," Elias said. "It stands in defiance of the United States government." Hargraves spat. He looked at the fortress. He looked at the massive logs. He seemed to realize this would be harder than he thought. "This is primitive defiance. It ends today. Men, tear down the porch. We will pull this thing apart, log by log." The men advanced, their boots sucking in the mud. They looked at the size of the timbers, then at their tools. This was not a trapper's shanty. "Be careful of the ground," Elias called out, his voice even. "She's not stable." Hargraves laughed. "A threat, Thorne? It won't work." He motioned to his men. "Start with that main beam." 2 of the men slung their sledges. 2 others put their shoulders to the main porch support. Kills the Cold stepped out into the light. "The mountain is sick," the old warrior said. "The snow melts. The ground moves. You walk on a bad place." The men paused. They were used to danger, but the old man's voice had a chill. Hargraves was furious. "Do not listen to him. He is a savage. Do your work." The men obeyed. One swung his sledge against the post. The sound was a dull thud. The post did not move. He swung again, harder. The vibration, the repeated shock was all it took. It was not the cabin that gave way. It was the mountain. With a sound like a wet sigh, a section of the slope above them, saturated with meltwater, let go. It was not a great avalanche. It was a river of heavy mud, slush, and rock. It surged downward, directly toward Hargraves and his crew. The reckoning was not made of powder and lead. It was made of mud. It was the earth itself, rejecting the arrogance of the inspector. The slide was fast. Elias and Kills the Cold, standing on the solid stone foundation, were safe. The crew, standing on the saturated ground, were not. "Back!" Elias yelled. The men tried to scatter. The river of mud and ice hit them. It knocked two men off their feet, burying them to the waist. It slammed into Hargraves's horse, throwing the inspector clear, but he landed hard, his leg folding beneath him. He screamed, a high, thin sound. The mud was alive. It was heavy, like wet cement. The two buried men were struggling, but the suction was pulling them down. The other crew members stood frozen, terrified. Elias Thorne did not hesitate. He grabbed the long, heavy pole he used to clear snow from the roof. Kills the Cold was right behind him, carrying ropes. They moved not on the mud, but on the edge of the slide, where the ground was firmer. "Don't fight it!" Elias yelled to the trapped men. "Stay still!" He reached the first man, extending the pole. "Grab it!" The man's eyes were wide with panic. He grabbed the pole, and Elias used his weight, his knowledge of leverage, to provide a brace. Kills the Cold threw a rope, looping it under the man's arms. Together they dragged him free from the mud's grip. He crawled to solid ground, covered in filth, gasping. They moved to the second man. He was deeper, the mud already at his chest. They worked quickly, the old warrior and the builder, a silent team. They freed him too. Then they went for Hargraves. The inspector was trying to stand, but his leg was clearly broken. He was pale, his teeth chattering. His expensive coat was ruined. He looked up as Elias approached, and his face was a mixture of pain and profound humiliation. He, the agent of progress, the man with the paper and the law, was helpless. He was being rescued by the primitive he had come to destroy. Elias and Kills the Cold lifted him, fashioning a quick splint from a fallen branch and strips of leather. They carried him, his arms draped over their shoulders, back across the muddy ground. They carried him onto the porch, past the scarred doorframe, and into the cabin. They laid him down on the bearskin rug, near the fire. Hargraves was silent. He was shaking, partly from cold, partly from shock. Elias handed him a cup of hot black coffee. The inspector took it with a trembling hand. And then, for the first time, he looked. He looked at the cabin from the inside. He looked at the massive hand-hewn beams above him. He saw the joinery, the wooden pegs, the perfect, seamless fit. He felt the radiating warmth from the stones. He heard the wind howl outside, but inside there was only the sound of the fire and the quiet drip of melting snow. He had told Elias the cabin would not last the winter. He, with his city clothes, had barely lasted 10 minutes in the spring thaw. He had called this place a shack, and it had just saved his life. The inspection was finally complete. The fortress had been judged not by paper but by the mountain, and it had held. At dawn, the crew returned for their inspector. They had made a crude litter. They looked humbled, their faces streaked with mud, their arrogance gone. They hoisted Hargraves, who winced in pain. He did not speak. He did not look at Elias. But as they carried him past the doorframe, he stopped them. He reached out, his hand trembling, and his fingers brushed the scar in the wood where the nail had been. He said nothing. He just touched the wood. Then he motioned for his men to move on. They disappeared into the mist, a broken procession. Kills the Cold watched them go. "The paper is weak," the old warrior said. "The wood is strong." Elias nodded. He looked at the door. The nail was gone. Hargraves had pulled it free before he left, taking his shame with him. But the hole remained. A small wound, a reminder. Elias Thorne lived in that valley for another 30 years. He tended his small garden, he hunted, he maintained his cabin. The railroad came, but it did not come through his valley. The surveyors had rerouted. The cost of blasting through the high, unstable slopes was deemed too great. They had bent their straight iron line around the mountain, around the fortress of wood and patience. Elias replaced the scarred doorframe 2 winters later, finding a new piece of seasoned fir and carving it with the same care. The cabin stood. Travelers, explorers, and sometimes young men from the new towns would pass through seeking shelter. They would sit by his fire and marvel at the joinery. They would ask him how he built it, how it stood against the winters that crushed lesser homes. Elias would just point to the beams. "You listen to the wood," he would say. "You don't force it. You find how it wants to join." The legacy of Elias Thorne wasn't in a name on a map. It was in the structure itself. It was a lesson in permanence. It taught that what is built with arrogance and haste, what is held together with iron and paper, will eventually be broken by the land. But what is built with respect, with patience, with an understanding of the old ways that endures, it becomes part of the mountain. It holds its own. True strength isn't about power or authority. It is about integrity. It is about knowing the grain of the wood, the weight of the snow, and the truth of your own work. The inspector had his code, the mountain had its own, and the fortress had passed the only inspection that ever mattered. If you enjoyed this story, stay a while longer by the fire. There are more tales from the high country where honor rides the wind.